Welcome grade 11 learners to another installment of Life Sciences. Today we're looking at the overview of human nutrition, and this is on the back of having done photosynthesis in plants, looking at the applications of it and the importance of it. What we need to understand in the context of nutrition is that plants were able to photosynthesize, produce their food, and use some of that energy for the essential processes like respiration. However, when we look at autotrophs, they were able to photosynthesize. Now we're moving on to animals or organisms that are heterotrophs. And what do we mean by that? We mean organisms that need a mechanism of taking in food and processing that food to obtain the energy. So let's look at the contents, let's look at the main concepts that we need to, and then we're going to engage with some questions, and I hope you guys are going to get involved as well. Let's look at the overview, the human digestive system. And here I've got quite a nice diagram. And this diagram essentially gives you an overview of what the nutrition system and the digestive system is. We're going to talk about this diagram as we get through. What are some of the main terminology that we're looking at today? We've got to look at what the digestive system is. And what do we mean by the term digestive system? So obviously it's the system, so we're dealing with a collection of organs that perform a specific function. And when we look at digestive, it refers to a system that is responsible for the process of digesting, processing food. And guys, the second important term is alimentary canal. And if we look at the term alimentary canal, it's in the context of the passage or the pathway that food passes through when it is ingested to the point at where it is released or egested from the body. And if you guys recollect, we've done when we looked at invertebrates, we looked at the arrangement of organisms, and one of the characteristics that we discussed was through gut. The through gut obviously referred to an organism having an anterior opening and a posterior opening through which food would pass through one end and be released through the other end. And essentially we're looking at the alimentary canal as being a through gut. Obviously, when we look at the alimentary canal, there are organs that are associated with the digestive system or the alimentary canal. In that we mean, so these are organs that are associated but not directly form part of the digestive system. Nutrition is a process, or it's a term that refers to the way in which organisms acquire their food and how that food is ingested and then assimilated to be utilized. Homeostasis is quite an important term, and we've got to look at this in the next couple of episodes, but homeo refers to an environment and stasis would be constant. So we're looking at how the home, meaning environment, is maintained constant. So in the context of the human body, we're looking at how the body maintains a constant internal environment, and that process is called homeostasis. We have looked at the terms herbivores before, but when we look at how we classify organisms based on their mode of nutrition, we get herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, and that's linked to their predominant type of organic compound in their diet. And herbivores are organisms that consume plant material, carnivores would consume meat, or they consume proteins that are animal proteins, and omnivores would be organisms that consume both plant material and animal tissue. And dentition would be when we look at the arrangement of the organism's teeth and the types of teeth that they have based on their type of nutrition that they show. So that's more or less an overview of the terminology, but we are going to look at some of the details around some of the other terms that we look at. Let's look at the key concepts today. When we look at nutrition, it is divided into 5 main processes, and when we discuss those processes, we will discuss the alimentary canal simultaneously. So nutrition is made up of the first process called ingestion, and ingestion essentially is the process that refers to how food enters the mouth and what happens in the buccal cavity or the mouth or the oral cavity. The next process is digestion, and that refers to what happens to the food as it moves from the mouth down the esophagus. And then eventually when that food is undergone the process of digestion, it needs to be absorbed, and that would refer to how the body and the bloodstream absorb some of that nutrition. And then finally we're looking at assimilation, which is what happens to all that food, all that organic compounds that are broken up into the monomers and then absorbed. How are they assimilated? How are they made up to assist the body in its specific functions or metabolism? And then finally, the process of digestion, and that's the removal of the products that are undigested or undigestible products. And essentially, we refer to that process as digestion. So that's an overview of the 5 main steps in nutrition. We also need to look at, why do we need food, guys? Why is food important? Firstly, you know that when you do have food, you feel energetic, and it's the main way in which the organism acquires energy to sustain the needs, the physiological needs of it. So most of the energy is provided through the process of ingestion of carbohydrates. And if you think about it, remember that plants were autotrophs, and they were manufacturing their own food, and hence they relied on sunlight. Here we look at heterotrophs, and heterotrophs are those organisms that rely on the autotrophs for food, and hence it is their main source of energy when they ingest carbohydrates that they're able to carry out metabolism. Obviously, we need food which provides the essential building blocks to repair and for growth. So when we grow, we need energy. To repair damaged tissue, guys, you need energy, and that damaged tissue needs to be replaced or rejuvenated by the essential building blocks that comes from the complex carbohydrates, organic compounds such as your fats and lipids, or even your proteins that are then broken up in the body, gone through a process of digestion, then it is assimilated to produce the proteins and repair muscles and other tissues. And then finally, it's important in the regulation of body processes. Guys, we need energy for cellular respiration, and that essential energy that comes from your plant material provides the building blocks for respiration to occur, as well as excretion. This requires ingestion of vitamins, water, and mineral salts. So when we look at the essential process of nutrition, it is vitally important that we understand that this is the way the body collects energy, uses that energy to build up, to repair, and to sustain the metabolic activities of the body. An overview of the digestive system. Remember that the digestive system contains 2 parts. It contains the alimentary canal and the accessory organs. Let's look at these separately. So the alimentary canal is a long tubular structure that extends throughout the body, and refer to that as the through gut, and that essentially means that the food enters through one end, goes through a process of digestion, assimilation, and absorption, and then the undigested parts are released to a separate opening at the exterior end or the posterior end, and we refer to that as being through gut system. So when we look at the alimentary canal, guys, it consists of the mouth and the mouth cavity, which has the tongue, it has teeth that play a very important part in the initial process of mechanical digestion, where food is crushed. It is then mixed with saliva, and it's processed, it's softened to form a bolus, and that bolus then enters the next part which is the pharynx, and the pharynx is where you have your epiglottis that will assist in swallowing of the food, and that goes down the esophagus, which is a long tube surrounded by muscles, and those muscles will contract and push the food down, and all that food then goes into the stomach, and from the stomach it goes into the small intestine, in which it undergoes the further process of absorption, digestion and absorption, and then the large intestine will be where essentially most of what is needed is absorbed. Most of the water that is needed by the body is absorbed from there, and the anus through which the food or undigestible waste products are removed. And then the accessory organs. These are organs that are associated with the alimentary canal. So they're not directly involved, so they may have a function over and above associated with the digestive system. And they play an important role in assisting for the process of nutrition. So if we look at the tongue, it's very important. We need it for tasting food. And the first sensory organ that allows us to understand the type of food that we're eating is the tongue. So it's loaded with millions of taste buds that pick up different signals or in terms of taste, and those are either sweet, sour, savory. There's a few others that will tell us whether the food is palatable or not. And often when you do taste something, it's your taste buds on the tongue that tells you whether something tastes good or not. And then you look at your salivary glands, very important part, and you've got 3 pairs of them, and these are essentially glands that produce salivary juices that assist in the initial process of digestion, and that's of carbohydrates. We also know that the pancreas plays an important role in the body, which we will look at in the next couple of episodes in terms of why it's both an important exocrine gland and endocrine gland, but it definitely will assist in the production of certain pancreatic juices that will assist in the process of digestion in the small intestine. And the liver, as an important organ in the body in terms of how that removes, denitrifies, it removes waste products, it produces bile, and then obviously the gallbladder is an organ that stores bile that will be released when needed. So that's an overview of it. Guys, let's get into, so I'm just going to very quickly go through the main parts of the digestive system before we get into questions. So as I said, when we look at the digestive system, we're going to look at it as a tube, a continuous tube through which food runs from the anterior end to the posterior end, and referred to that as the through gut system or the alimentary canal. Food is ingested through the oral cavity, and that's the mouth, and you've got your tongue, which will then basically taste food, and that will also assist. It's a muscular organ that will assist in mixing the food along with the teeth that play an important role in chewing and processing and mechanical digestion. That is then mixed with saliva by the tongue, and those glands that produce the salivary amylase are situated around your jaw area, and they collectively form salivary juice that then forms a ball called the bolus that is then ingested, that goes down the esophagus. It's a muscular tube made up of circular muscles and longitudinal muscles that will constantly contract and relax, causing the bolus or the ball of food to move down the esophagus. Food then enters the stomach, which is again an important part of the digestive system in which protein digestion occurs, and food from the stomach then goes into the small intestine, which is made up of three parts. We're looking at the duodenum, we're looking at so that's the duodenum here, that's the first circular sort of a S-shaped part that connects the stomach to the rest of the small intestine. We have the intestine being made up of the duodenum, the ileum, and the jejunum, and then that food then enters it goes through a process of digestion and then enters the large intestine. Here the first part of the large intestine is called the cecum, and at the opening between the cecum and the small intestine we have the appendix, and then food travels up this tube here called the ascending colon. Then we have it going through the transverse colon on that end, and then going down the descending colon to finally collect and temporarily be stored in the rectum, via which then food is released through the anal cavity, and then we refer to that process as egestion. So that's an overview of that. It's a very important diagram. You've got to learn the diagram, learn the different parts, and then we also have seen the associated organs. We've got the liver here, which is an associated gland. We've got the gallbladder here at the bottom there, which I've drawn over. That's the gallbladder. We've got the salivary glands, all sort of situated below the tongue and above there. We also have, let's see, so we've done that. The pancreas is situated right here. It's a leaf-shaped structure that all play an important role in supporting the digestive system in carrying out its function. So guys, we will look at a few questions now. So I thought we will start off this session by looking at some basic terminology, an overview of the topic, and then we get on some intricate questions. So let's go through this. A very good way to consolidate your learning is to go through terms and to build up a vocabulary of the various terms. So let's look at these descriptions and the correct term that describes them. So the finger-like projections in the small intestine. Guys, if we take a cross section through the small intestine, we'll see finger-like projections that project into the internal lumen, and those finger-like projections are called villi, and they're essentially to increase the surface area to bring the food or the contents that passes through the intestine into closer proximity or contact, and thereby facilitating a greater absorptive area of the small intestine. Let's look at the next term. Blood vessels, rich absorbed food that enters the liver. So which blood vessel will absorb the food that enters the liver? Okay, and that's the hepatic portal vein. So all the food that is then absorbed from the small intestine goes up via the hepatic portal vein to the liver, and that is where the food will then undergo a process of purification, removal of waste products, some bit of deaminification of excess amino acids. So the blood, before it goes back into the circulatory system, has to go to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. Cool. Let's see number 3. Process by which food moves along the entire alimentary canal. And as I said earlier on, when we look at the alimentary canal, food in the alimentary canal, starting from the esophagus, is a ball called the bolus. And that bolus is basically a round ball that is being produced after chewing of food. That bolus is going to be pushed along the alimentary canal through 2 processes. One is circular muscles contracting, and then you have the longitudinal muscles relaxing. So the alternate contraction and relaxation of the longitudinal and circular muscles, and vice versa, will cause the food to move, or the bolus to move along the alimentary canal. And often when you do find that your stomach's churning, or you find that after a meal that you sit down and you feel some kind of movement, and that movement is peristalsis. And essentially what's happening there is that there's contraction of the muscles along the alimentary canal that propel and that push the food through. Let's look at number 4. Organ that produces bile. And a very important organ, we looked at that. So the liver does produce bile, and that bile then travels via the bile duct to be stored in the gallbladder. So the organ that produces bile is the liver. We will look at the function of the bile and the liver in a little while. Digestive juices secreted by the stomach. The stomach plays a very important role in the digestion of proteins, and that is where the proteins start digesting. And that is the gastric juices, and it's obviously a very acidic pH, and it's around 2, guys. It's between 2 to 3. It's highly acidic, to that extent that if that acid was to get onto your hand, it could cause injury. How that prevents internal damage is that the gastric wall produces a mucus layer that neutralizes, that buffers the lining of the wall, thus preventing the gastric juice from damaging the internal lining of the stomach. So very important to know that the gastric juice is highly acidic. Number 6, the process by which food is broken down from large insoluble molecules into small soluble molecules. Guys, essentially what we're talking about here is the process of digestion, and that can occur through hydrolysis or through enzyme activity. So when food is broken down from large polypeptide molecules to smaller peptide molecules, we refer to that as digestion. We talk of how proteins are broken up into amino acids, how your carbohydrates are broken up into glucose, or even your fats and lipids being broken up into fatty acids and glycerol. That process where it's broken down is called digestion. And for that process of digestion, we've got to remember that there are very important enzymes that play important roles in that process. The form in which glucose is stored in the liver. We know that the liver plays an important role in storage, but storage of glucose needs to be taken place in a complex form called glycogen, and that glycogen is then stored in the liver and in muscle cells, which then provide a reserve energy when the body needs, or when the blood sugar levels drop. The liver then releases the stored glycogen with the assistance from the endocrine gland called the pancreas. We will look at that when we look at homeostasis. The use of absorbed food by the body cells. So essentially what happens is that in the small intestine, after digestion, there is absorption. What happens to that food when it gets into the bloodstream? It gets assimilated. And assimilated essentially means that when you absorb your amino acids, when you absorb glucose, when you absorb the fatty acids and lipids from the small intestine, what happens to that? And part of that goes into growth and repair of tissue. So we need amino acids to repair the proteins and to repair tissue and muscles. We need glucose for respiration. We need the fatty acids and the lipids to insulate the nerve cells, to provide the essential medium for the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. So when we look at that process, we refer to that process as assimilation. Let's look at number 9, the process by which fats are broken down into fat droplets and bile salts. So when the liver produces bile, that bile from the liver goes down into the gallbladder, and it's temporarily stored in the gallbladder. The gallbladder releases bile, and the bile will help to emulsify and break down the fat into smaller particles. And that process, when fats are broken down into fat droplets by bile salts is called emulsification. Quite an important term. Often you get this in your terminology. Number 10, system that is the main transporter of digestive fats from the gut. So what happens to the fats? When we look at the structure of the transverse folds in the small intestine, we see that there is a central lacteal, and that central lacteal contains your lymph system that absorbs the fat. So your fats are absorbed into that, and your fat molecules are then transported via the lymph vessel back into the circulatory system. So it's a separate system called the lymph vessel. Number 11, the lymph vessel found in the center of each villi. And as I said, that lymph vessel is called the central lacteal, and it's essentially what absorbs the fats that have been digested in the small intestine. Number 12, malnutrition disorder characterized by binge eating followed by purging. Now guys, obviously when we look at nutrition and having a balanced diet, we will look at some of the associated health or disorders or nutritional disorders that occur. One of it is when individuals have a disorder in which they binge eat followed by purging, or the bringing up and the removal of food from the body, and that is referred to as bulimia. Let's look at the next one, a condition where a child whose diet lacks protein. Here you find that the diet lacks protein, and it's predominantly carbohydrates or even starch, and that causes what we call kwashiorkor. And here these individuals have a distended belly and extreme muscle weakness for the rest of the body, and that's essentially because the body lacks protein, and hence there's lack of muscle development around the body. What happens is that the carbohydrates tend to cause a distension of the belly, and the belly appears larger than the rest of the body with extreme muscle wasting in the rest of the body. Let's look at number 14, a condition in children whose diet lacks protein and carbohydrates and experience muscle wasting, and that's called marasmus. Extremely weak children, loss of muscle weight, loss of body mass, muscles are weak, extremely lethargic, and often end up with permanent organ damage and failure. So guys, we've looked at the terminology. We're going to go in for a short break, and when we get back, we're going to look at some more questions. Welcome back, grade 11s. We continue with working with some activities. So let's see how we can apply some of those basic terminologies and the overview in the context of some of these questions. So I'm going to engage with you, give you an opportunity to work through some of these as well. Okay, study the image below of the human torso showing the digestive system and answer the questions that follow. So here we have the human digestive system labeled for us with different numbers and followed by a few questions. So we're going to have a look at this diagram. I'm going to refer to this when I do flip through the questions so that you can have access to this diagram as you work through the questions. Let's look at the questions. I'm going to read through these and then give you probably 3 minutes to work through these. Let's look at 2.1. Identify the parts of the digestive system labeled 3, 4, 5, and 6. And guys, when you do have a diagram like this, what I always encourage my learners to do is that very quickly try and label the diagram, label as much as you can so that you can go on to answering some of the questions knowing that these parts have been labeled, and you can use that in your answers. 2.2. State 3 functions related to the nutrition of part number 3. 2.3. Name the part located underneath part 3 that stores bile. 2.4. Name the digestive juice secreted by part 4. 2.5. What pH conditions are required for the efficient digestion to occur in parts 4 and 6 respectively? So guys, these are 5 questions. I'm going to give you guys, 3 minutes to work through them. In those 3 minutes, I'm going to flip through the diagram and back to the questions so that you can see both the diagram and the questions. So 3 minutes, have a good discussion with your friends and come back and we will have a look at the answers. So I hope you guys enjoyed those questions. Let's look at the solutions to that. Some difficult questions, but nothing that you wouldn't have been able to solve. So let's look at the answers to some of these questions. Cool, so let's look at them. So the first question was, identify the parts of the digestive system labeled 3, 4, 5 and 6. And as I said, label as much as you can. And if you looked at number 3, 3 was the liver. So I'm just going to very quickly go back to our diagram so I can help you label all the parts. So that shows the esophagus. So the esophagus there. Here we're seeing below that, that's the heart. And obviously we know the function of the heart. Number 3 is the liver. Number 4 shows you the stomach. Number 5 shows you the small intestine, and that's the duodenum. Small intestine, that's the first part of the duodenum, of the small intestine, called the duodenum. And then number 6 is the large intestine, or we refer to that as the colon. So that's what I've done, and that's what you should have done when you've seen any diagram in a test. Very quickly label those parts. So number 3 was the liver, number 4 the stomach, number 5 refers to the transverse colon, and essentially that is that part of this colon that goes up there, and that's the transverse colon. And number 6 was the small intestine. Let's look at number 2.2. State 3 functions related to the nutrition of part number 3. And if you go back to part number 3 was the liver. So let's look at 3 functions of the liver. Very important organ in the body. Let's look at why. So guys, firstly, the liver secretes bile, and bile is an important salt that helps in the emulsification of fat. So in the digestion of fats, we need bile that is produced by the liver, and that bile is stored in the gallbladder. The second importance of the liver, it converts glucose to glycogen, which is stored in liver and muscle cells. So it plays a very important role in the conversion of glucose to a complex carbohydrate called glycogen. Number 3, what's the third one? It converts excess glucose to fat and stores it. So it also can, over and above storing it as glycogen, it can convert it to fat and store that excess fat, especially in organisms that rely on food during unfavorable conditions. They tend to eat and collect that fat under their skin as adipose tissue so that it can be used to insulate them, or during periods of hibernation. Let's look at the fourth one. It deaminates excess amino acids, resulting in the formation of urea. So guys, no matter when you consume protein, some of those proteins are broken up into amino acids, and some of the amino acids are utilized. However, the excess amino acids are deaminified. The amino groups are broken up, and that is how you have urea being produced as a waste product that needs to be removed from the body. It detoxifies certain harmful substances and makes them harmless. So the liver plays an important role in detoxifying the removal of waste products in terms of alcohol and drugs. So those toxic substances that ingest your body, often medication that you take, simple things like paracetamol that enter your body, they will undergo a process of detoxification by the liver, and hence often certain medications have side effects. Alcohol has a drastic effect on the liver in terms of leading to liver cirrhosis. So we've got to think about what we put into the body and the effect that it has on the different organs. And for one, the liver being an organ that can regenerate to some extent, we've got to look at what we ingest to prevent the liver from being damaged. Let's look at 2.3. Name the part located underneath part 3 that stores bile. So here we're looking at underneath part 3, what stores bile? And that's essentially the gallbladder. So when we look at the gallbladder, it's the gland that is situated just below the stomach and the small intestine here, and that is what stores the bile. 2.4. Name the digestive juice secreted by part 4. And as I said earlier on, the stomach produces gastric juice, which is very acidic, between 2 to 3, and it's an acidic juice that plays an important role in the digestion of your polypeptides. So your complex protein molecules are digested or start the process of digestion in the stomach. 2.5. What pH conditions are required for the efficient digestion to occur of parts numbered 4 and 6 respectively? Guys, if you could recollect parts number 4 and 6, that we labeled. So part number 4 was the stomach, and for the stomach we need an acidic medium, guys, and we know that the gastric juices, as we said earlier on, provides a pH that's about 2.3. So in the stomach you have gastric juice that creates an acidic medium, and that's between 2.5, and that is for the digestion of your proteins and breaking down the complex proteins into your shorter polypeptides. So your long protein molecules, or the bigger protein molecules, are then broken up into shorter polypeptide molecules, shorter chains of amino acids that then go into the small intestine, that then undergo further digestion in terms of breaking those shorter polypeptides, now releasing them into amino acids. Part number 5 is the small intestine, and that is quite unique to understand. So here's the stomach, and then we have the small intestine, which is starting off with the duodenum. And guys, here we have quite an acidic pH of food that enters. So here we've got the chyme that goes in from there into the small intestine. Here we've got, as I said earlier on, here it's a pH between 2 to 3, and here we get a pH of between 7, or sometimes it's even 8 to 9. So here we've got 7.5 to 8.9. Here we've got a basic or an alkaline medium. So here we see the transition from acidic in the stomach to an alkaline medium in the small intestine. And that's very important for us to understand in the context of how the pancreas plays an important role in producing a buffer that neutralizes the acidic pH. But we'll look at that at greater detail in the next segment. So cool. So that was the questions that related to the small intestine and the stomach in terms of the medium and the pH in there. Let's look at some more questions on this section. Study the image below of the human torso. So again, questions relating to the same diagram. Let's get straight to the questions and see how we can interpret these. So, which is the only organic compound that is chemically digested in part number 4? And part number 4, guys, was the stomach. So we've got to remember that as I discussed this. What is the only thing that is digested in the stomach? 2.7. Name the end product of digestion that will be present in part number 6 as a result of the action of the 3 main groups of digestive enzymes. So part number 6 was the small intestine. 2.8. Name the part that produces insulin and glucagon that is located behind organ number 4. So guys, 3 more questions. I think I'll give you a minute for these to have a very quick discussion, and then when we get back we will look at the answers and then probably take a little longer break. So a minute for you guys to work through these questions. Well, I think you guys needed a bit longer than a minute there, so I'm glad you had that time. Let's work through these answers very quickly, and then we'll look at probably giving you a longer break. So cool. 2.6. Which is the only organic compound that is chemically digested in part number 4? The only organic compound. That's the key part of the question. Let's look at that. So it's proteins, and as I said earlier on, your proteins are broken up from your large protein molecules into shorter polypeptide molecules that then further undergo in the small intestine digestion to release your amino acids. So we're looking at proteins and polypeptides being broken down further. 2.7. Name the end product of digestion that will be present in part 6 as a result of the action of the 3 main groups of digestive enzymes. So let's look at the answers for that. So this was Ka. So when you look at what happens to the food that enters from the from the stomach into the small intestine, here you've got that contents that now becomes Ka, and that's the mixture of the juices from the intestine as well as from the pancreas that mix together to form a basic or an alkaline medium called Ka. Let's look at the next question. Sorry, let me go back there. One more question at the bottom of that. Name the part that produces insulin and glucagon that is located behind organ number 4. And guys, when you look at organ number 4, even if we didn't have the diagram, so what is the organ that produces insulin and glucagon? And that's that leaf-shaped structure that we refer to as the pancreas. So when we look at the pancreas, guys, the pancreas plays an important role in the production of both. Sorry, let me go back. Okay. Okay, that's jumping a bit. I think we're enthusiastic to get on to the next question, but we got time for that. Okay, so when we look at the pancreas, it plays an important role in the release of both insulin and glucagon, as we see here. And that is an important endocrine gland and an exocrine gland that functions both in terms of maintaining homeostasis with regards to the blood sugar levels, as well as producing pancreatic juices that are important in the process of digestion. So guys, you guys have done well. It's been a longer session. Let's take a short break, and when we get back, we will look at a few more questions. Welcome back, guys. I hope you guys have stretched a bit, had some nutrition to keep you sustained. We're in the last segment. It's going to be about 9 minutes, so we're going to look at a very important part of the digestive system, which is the small intestine. And I think this question is very important in terms of understanding the small intestine and how it's significantly adapted for its function. So let's look at this question, the next one. Study the diagram below of a cross-section through the small intestine and answer the questions that follow. So guys, if you remember, if you look at the small intestine, it's a highly convoluted structure. It's a tube-like structure. When we say cross-section, we've taken a section looking at how the intestine looks in a cross-section. So essentially what we're looking at is this image, okay, with many concentric rings and the large lumen in the center. However, what I've done is I've taken all that and I've created a section of that small intestine, and I've enlarged it here and labeled it. So here we're looking at the various layers of the small intestine labeled in different layers. So I hope these can be clearly seen. You've got one layer, second layer, the third layer, you've got the fourth layer, and you've got a couple more layers with these distinct folded layers at number 6. So that's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So it's essentially showing you quite a multi-layered tube that is contained within the internal structure of the small intestine, ending with these folds called microvilli or villus, and then we look at the microvilli on them. So let's get straight to some of these questions. 3.1. Identify the labels numbered 1 to 6, which we will do in a little while. Number 3.2. State 4 adaptations of the small intestine for effective absorption. This is a very important question. Often you would get a question which which would require you to explain how the small intestine is adapted for absorption. 3.3. Name the 3 main regions of the small intestine, and that's quite an easy question. And then name the functions of the small intestine. So let's look at these 4 questions and try and unpack the answers for them. Okay, so I'm sure you guys are thinking about these answers like I have. So what I've done is I've put the answers down for you. So let's look at number 6. So I'm going to go back, so I'm going to answer these questions here and then obviously look at the diagram once more at the end. So number 1 is the outer serous layer, and that's a layer of connective tissue found on the external surface of the small intestine. Number 2 is a layer of longitudinal muscles, and these are muscles that run longitudinally along the tube. So when we look at a cross section of it, so these would be muscles that are running longitudinally down. Number 3 would refer to the circular muscles, and these are muscles that are running around the radius and that help in the contraction. So we look at it. Number 4 is the submucosal layer, and that's a layer that's below or in the inner surface of the circular muscles. Number 5 is the mucosal layer, and that layer is a layer that's rich in villi that produce the gastric juices, the intestinal juices that are required for the process of digestion. So I'm going to go back to that diagram very quickly so we can put this into the context of the diagram. So number 1, so very important for you to look at is, as we said, we're going to start with this. So these are the villi. Here you've got your mucous layer, mucosa. Here you've got your submucosa. Number 4 was your inner circuit. Number 3 was your circular muscles. Number 2 was your longitudinal muscles. And the outer serous connective tissue. So essentially you should be labeling this diagram at the start and then answering the questions. Let's look at 3.2. Okay. State 4 adaptations of the small intestine for effective absorption. So how is the small intestine adapted for making the process of absorption very effective? One is that it's very long. It's approximately 6 meters. No, sorry, I would be lying. It's very long in that sense that it's about 3 meters long. The total length of the digestive system, the alimentary canal, is about 6 meters, of which the longest part is the small intestine. It's made up of transverse folds in the walls. And these transverse folds, guys, if you look at these folds, they basically increase the surface area to make the process of absorption more effective. And on these folds, there are villi. And these villi are basically finger-like projections. So if we look at this, so here you've got villi on the transverse folds. And on these villi, you have further microvilli on their surfaces. So what we see is that we're seeing villi, and then on the surface of the villi, these microvilli. So we've got villi, we've got microvilli, we've got transverse folds, and we've got the length that collectively make the absorption function of the small intestine highly effective. 3.3. Name the 3 main regions of the small intestine. So we're looking at 3 regions of the small intestine. Quite a simple question that you should know based on your understanding of. So the first part, which joins from the stomach to the small intestine, is called the duodenum. The middle part is called the jejunum, and then the last part that connects to the small intestine, to the large intestine here, is called the ileum. So the ileum is the last part of it, and in between those folds is the jejunum. So you've got the duodenum, the jejunum, and lastly the ileum that connects to the cecum, which then starts off the colon. 3.4. Name the functions of the small intestine. And guys, it's important for you to understand what the mark allocation for this question is. And a rough guide would be, if it's a 4-mark question, provide 4 functions. If it's an 8-mark question, you will provide 8 functions. So I have not necessarily looked at the mark allocation. I just wanted to discuss broadly the main function of the small intestine. Okay, so obviously, guys, it's a layer of muscles in the wall of the small intestine that causes peristalsis. So the first function is that it causes peristalsis, and that's through the contraction of those radial and those longitudinal muscles that collectively help to propel and to push food by the contraction and relaxation of those circular and radial muscles. We refer to them as antagonistic muscles because they bring about they work alternatively to each other, and that is essentially what helps to propel food along the digestive system. So when you have a meal, you could lie down, and while you're lying, that process of digestion occurs where food is pushed along via peristalsis, which moves the chyme forward and ensures that it becomes thoroughly mixed with the digestive juices. So this contraction and relaxation causes the mixing and brings the digestive juices in more closer contact with the food so that the process of digestion can be optimized. You also have glands in the duodenal wall called the crypts of Leibukun and the Brunner's gland. And these 2 glands play a very important role in the secretion of intestinal juices to maintain firstly the alkaline medium, to neutralize the acidic chyme coming from the stomach. And so the crypts of Leibukun and your Brunner's gland secrete digestive juices called intestinal juices, which play a significant role in the process of digestion. Finally, the small intestine has millions of villi and microvilli, which increase the surface area for the absorption of digested nutrients. So if you look at the digestive system, guys, we just looked at the overview of the system today. What is important for us to understand is the context of looking at how the digestive system, especially the small intestine, is adapted for making the process highly effective. Look at the different parts, look at their contribution to the process of digestion, look at where the process of digestion starts to where the process of digestion finishes in terms of egestion and the removal of waste products. So guys, we've spent a significant time looking at an overview of this process of digestion. In our next installment, we're going to look at the actual process of digestion in terms of how the enzymes are secreted and what their functions are. Take care, work smart, see you next week.